Welcome to the Maybe I Can podcast. I'm your host, Debbie Weiss. I'm here to motivate and inspire you to stop using your circumstances as an excuse, just like I used to. An excuse to not take control of your life. It's time to stop living your life on autopilot and start taking purposeful action to create the life you truly desire. Let's do this together.
Okay, everyone, welcome back to the How to Podcast series. I have a podcaster right there from the Maybe I Can podcast. Debbie Weiss is here with me, and Debbie's been on other podcasts with me, and I get to have more time with Debbie, which makes me happy. And it's a great podcast, and I would love for you to check it out. Maybe I Can. It's a podcast for you. Debbie, welcome to the How to Podcast series. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me. I can't believe, honestly, that I'm on a show called How to Podcast. Am I here to be a novice or give some sage advice?
You have a podcast, so you qualify. Even if you're thinking of starting a podcast, you qualify to be on the show. So I'm excited. You're an expert. You're a pro. And I would love for you to talk about your podcast. Let's start there.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that. So yes, as you already said, my podcast is called Maybe I Can, and it launched on May 1st. So I'm about almost 3 months in now. And I have to say, I absolutely love it. The idea of the podcast is to inspire and motivate people to understand that regardless of their circumstances, their age, anything, you just switch that mindset from an I can't attitude to maybe I can. So I like to offer some kind of strategy in each of the podcasts and then interview a guest who has in fact gone from an I can't to a maybe I can mindset and changed their lives.
Amazing. So this all started though more as a blog, I guess, and then transformed into becoming a podcast. Can you talk about the difference between the two in that journey?
Sure. So yes, it did start as a blog. And honestly, I never saw myself as a blogger or a podcaster. But when I started writing my book, that's going to be out August 9th, I actually discovered that I enjoyed writing, and that was brand new to me. And so I started taking some of those stories that I was writing and just tried to gear them more towards a weekly message. And I was enjoying doing that. But quite frankly, I have a business coach who kept saying, you need to start a podcast. You need to start a podcast. And I said, yeah, I'm not ready. I'm not ready. Just the thought of it was so overwhelming. How am I going to know what to do? Do I need special equipment? It was intimidating. And so I just kept pushing her off, thinking that it's not the perfect time until I realized, you know what? It's never going to be the perfect time. And she said, you are honestly going to like it more than the blogging. And she was right. I find it much easier and more comfortable. Even though I can't see my audience, I still do feel like I'm talking to somebody and having a conversation. And I enjoy that a lot more than the blogging, which I feel is just kind of talking at someone.
Yeah. It's a totally different feel. And the one thing that's hard to do in blogging is to add inflection, maybe sarcasm at sometimes, emotion. They're words on a page, right? It's really hard to capture that. But of spoken word, people can hear when you're rushed or when you're anxious or when you're happy. It's in your voice. And I love that you can use that as a tool to convey a message to your audience.
And I think it's more personal. People feel like they know you because you're talking to them, right? Which is what we are doing. We are talking to you, the audience, and they feel that. And that it just, by listening, they feel like they know you personally. And that's kind of what we're looking for.
And what I love is you have a great speaking voice. It's very welcoming and warm. And that brings people in as well. So congratulations on that. I'm so happy that you have a podcast and that it's working for you. What are some of the things that was kind of a learning curve for you starting your show?
So many things. Still a learning, still a learning curve. Still definitely a learning curve. The content, coming up with what are people going to enjoy? Do I have enough to say? Do you write it all out beforehand? Do people practice it? And I'm sure that everybody, especially in the beginning, obviously it morphs once you become more comfortable.
Yeah.
But what do you do in the beginning to make yourself more comfortable? And, I realized I'm not going to write out exactly what I'm going to say. First of all, you don't want people to feel like you're reading a piece of paper.
Yeah.
So just making that outline. And as I start talking, sometimes I feel like I veer off and I'm in another direction and I'm like, uh-oh, wait a second. What was I supposed to be talking about? If I don't have that other person, that's why it is nice when we're talking to each other, because you can reel me back in. So that was definitely a challenge.
I need that too as well. Just I want to put that out in the world that I need that as well. It is very helpful to have somebody to bounce ideas off of and have a conversation with. It's great.
Yeah. The other challenge, and this is what I was going to ask you about, or I'd like to ask you about, is when I have guests on, I listen to other podcasters and it sounds so easy to just have a conversation. And it's like, no big deal. I talk to people all the time. I'm finding that I'm uncomfortable interviewing people. Maybe I'm trying to force something. I come up with some questions beforehand because I'm afraid of that silent space. And I think I might be too tuned into the questions instead of just pulling from, having a conversation. And I'm thinking about, maybe for a while I won't do interviews and it will just be a solo. So what is your take on a solo episode versus an interview?
So first of all, and I think the listening audience will agree with me completely, you do not sound like you have a problem doing interviews. You just asked me an amazing question. You framed it well. You brought in a little of your story into the question, and you weren't reading it. So you kind of answered your own question there. I think you did fabulous. Just so you know, I want to give you that to start with. And I think the listening audience would agree. People will be listening going, I don't hear what you're asking, because you're demonstrating something totally different than what you're asking. So just put that out there in the world, just so you understand. From my perspective, you have nothing to worry about.
Well,
it sounded great. So
thank you.
I love solo episodes because the audience gets time with you one-on-one. And that's a great way to build depth into your audience, and they feel connected with you. When you share the stage with an interview, you're sharing the stage with somebody else. And your audience is kind of like, I came here for Debbie, but okay, well, we have a guest. That's great. I love the guest. I trust Debbie to bring a guest that means something for me as a listener. That's the first thing.
Absolutely.
You're not going to have somebody on coming to talk about horses, because it's nothing to do with your podcast. So I trust you implicitly that you're going to bring value through your guests. So I don't really need, a little tip for you as well, I don't really need a big backstory on the guest, because if you said yes to the guest, I'm already in as a listener. Let's get into the content, because you wouldn't bring somebody here that didn't bring value to the conversation. So I trust you without having to know everything about the guest before we get into the content. So I'm ready to go and listen to what this person has to say more than what they've done in the past. Just one thing to think about as you interview.
Okay.
But so having one-on-one time with you and your audience as a solo episode is great, because it builds depth, builds quality, builds community. But then having a guest expands your connections and your reach and brings a different voice to the conversation. And if you can do both, I think that's a great mix of both. I have some podcasts where it's all interviews. Every podcast is an interview. And it feels odd because I never really talk to my audience directly, just me and them. I'm always speaking with a guest on behalf of my audience. So I'm really kind of thinking it myself. Maybe I should throw in an episode or two here and there to talk about a little bit more about me and talk to my audience directly. So you're making me think with that question, by the way.
So glad to hear it. So is there a formula? Does it matter? Right now I'm kind of in a every other week schedule, every other week interview, every other week solo. Do you think there's a sweet spot there?
I like variety. I would probably lean more towards your solo episodes. Again, the benefit of solo episodes is you don't have to rely on a calendar. You can record them anytime, and you can also batch record a whole bunch in a row, and then release them over time when you have time. So if you have a window of time to record, you're not waiting for someone to respond in a calendar and do all this setup, and you're on their schedule and you have to make things work. You can just get on the microphone and record 2, 3, 5 episodes on your own, and then plan them out when you want to release them around the interviews. I like that part because there's more flexibility for you as the host. So I lean more to the solo if I'm going to do a mix of the two, just because it gives me the opportunity to kind of plan around my calendar instead of being totally reliant on my guests to fill in the calendar and fill in the spots, because then I'm waiting for them all the time, right?
Yeah, which makes sense. I think only once I did 2 solo episodes, batched them, but that was like enough for me. I was my brain was spent. I couldn't go on any further because forget it. Then I definitely would have been off topic. My brain had turned to mush. So what about the other thing that I struggle with is the length. So on the solo episodes, I just seem to be naturally kind of like stopping and wrapping it up around the 20-minute mark, which I'm happy with. But I'm having trouble capping the interviews. I mean, here I thought I was not going to be able to have enough content. And the next thing you know, I always, with the interviews, I seem to be like at 50 minutes or an hour. And I think about myself as a listener, and I think it depends, right? Like sometimes I have a 20, 25-minute commute to work, which I think is fairly average. It's nice to be able to finish one episode in that time, be done, not have to remember, 8 hours later, hey, what were they talking about when I was listening at 8:00 this morning? But then on the other hand, if you're enjoying the guest, well, then keep it going. What do you think with that time question?
I read a book, and one of the quotes they said is, "There's never too long, just too boring." And so the idea behind that is make the content long enough to capture what you want to say or what your guest is here to say, but don't go any longer. If you have 10 minutes worth of material on a solo episode, but you do 20-minute episodes, don't stretch 10 minutes of content into 20, right? Because then you start going off your path and down talking about things that have nothing to do with your content, and your listeners are like, why are we talking about this again? Right? So if it's a 10-minute episode, it's a 10-minute episode, and the next episode is 20, it's 20. You got to think too that there's a variety of listeners who are all listening in different ways, on a commute, like you mentioned, or in the gym, or they're a stay-at-home parent and they don't travel, they don't go out of the house, and they have a 2-hour block of time. They'll listen to 3 of your episodes. So if we only think of carpooling as the only way that people listen, I'm not saying you're doing that, but it's popular to say that, then I know my carpools could be up to an hour and a half. So again, I'm going to need a longer episode. I know of a farmer, and he listens on his tractor, and he's in his tractor 8 to 12 hours a day.
Sure.
He busts through a ton of podcasts because he's got to do something to keep his mind on his job, because he's just going back and forth and back and forth. So there's a variety of people listening. So I think the biggest thing is what works for you and what works for your content, and just use that as a frame.
Okay. That's a great advice, because, I think sometimes you look at the algorithms or read all the different blogs on podcasting, what you should and shouldn't do. And, especially for a newbie like me, I get in my head looking for what's going to make it work. What are people going to enjoy?
Yeah. And then when it comes to the interview part, my interviews can be, again, 15 minutes to an hour and 20. And it depends on the content, depends on my guest, depends on the conversation. But even then, I'll still do editing within an interview. For example, if I said to you, Debbie, what is your favorite blueberry recipe? And you're like, I'm allergic to blueberries. I don't eat them. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to actually take that question out and your answer out of that interview, because it doesn't have any value for the listener. Okay. And it's not, and we didn't really talk about that part. So I need to do a better job understanding you as a guest before I ask a question like that. But if it doesn't feed the topic, or my question wasn't clear and maybe you answered it the best you could, but it was my bad question that made this awkward, then I'm just going to take that section out and no one's even going to know. So that's going to reduce my hour interview maybe to 45 minutes when I do all these little edits. So I try to take out anything that would be quote unquote boring from either my guest or from me, so that my audience gets the best content from our conversation possible. So that's kind of how I approach that.
That's great, because I don't do my own editing. I have a virtual assistant who does it, and she doesn't do it listening like that. She's just listening for too many ums or big breaks of silence or stuff like that. And actually, I think she's running it through a program. I don't even think that she's actually listening to anything that we're saying.
Yeah.
But it's a valuable way to edit for sure.
Yeah. And the one thing you can do if you're working with a virtual assistant is just give them the timestamp. So if you know that at minute 132 to 142, you want that piece taken out, you just let them know, can you just remove this little section?
Yeah.
And most of the editors that are out there can do that pretty simply.
True. So let me ask you something else, something that I didn't mention to you before. I recently am volunteering to be a co-host on another podcast for an I just recorded actually about an hour ago for an organization that I volunteer for. It's called BW Nice, which stands for Business Women Networking Involving Charity and Education. And so it is, it's a mouthful. BW Nice is a lot better, but nobody understands what it means. And it's a group of women, obviously business women networking, but each of the chapters supports a local domestic violence safe house.
Nice.
And so it's women coming together to network and to also help people in the community. It's great. It's an amazing organization. I've been involved for many, many years, and they had done 2 seasons of podcasts. Each season had 2 different guest hosts. And during the pandemic, which should have been the time really where it picked up, everything just seemed to fall apart. And so now I'm a co-host trying to bring it back for season 3 after several years of silence. And, the co-hosting, I'm finding challenging too. Like here, I thought I didn't want to be the one interviewing, but on the other hand, I feel like, when do I say a question? When does she say a question? And we just did it before and we talked over each other. And luckily it was near the end and we were both trying to give a wrap up question. And so I just kind of laughed and said to the guest, now you have to answer it twice. But have you co-hosted before on a regular basis?
I have. And I guess there's a couple little tips that I've picked up listening to other podcasters as well. The one thing I like, are you both in the same room or are you doing this remotely?
Remotely.
Okay. So if you use for something like Google Docs, for example, it's a shared document where you can have it on your screen off to the side. Like right now where we're talking, I have your website on my screen and you're on the right-hand side of my screen. So I'm looking at your website. I can do things while we're talking. And while you're speaking, I can be looking at my document and then we come back and talk to you on the other half of my screen. So on a Google Doc, You can have say you have 4 points you want to cover in your podcast. Point number 1, 2, 3, and 4. And you're going to trade off. So I'll do 1 and you do 2, and then I'll do 3 and you do 4. So I can follow along and I can see while you're talking and you're doing your point that you're coming to the end of your point. So I know you're going to stop because it's my turn after I'm doing 2 and you just did 1. So I can read along while you're doing your part. And when you finish, I'm ready to come in. So because I'm following the script, I'm not reading it, but I can see where you're going. And I know you're going to wrap up in a second. So I know it's my turn. So I don't
But
have to
let's
talk
say-
over you. I can just wait
But-
and see for this to happen.
But let's say that you have a follow-up question. Does that mean that you don't make any comments during my segment? So in other words, if the guest says something and I'm the co-host not talking, but I have a question, am I not allowed to say it?
You can also, if you're using Zoom like we're doing right now, there's a chat function. And you can actually just type something and say, I have a question, or just write comment. And then the person talking knows that you have something to say. You can use that. That's another tool. You can actually have the Google document open, and the two of you could have it open at the same time. It's updated live. So you could be in there typing and your co-host could be like, oh, yeah, Debbie, you had a thought about this as well. And just by letting them know through either the document or the chat function or where we're using Zoom, that they know that you have something to say. You can do that as well. The big thing I would say for anybody jumping into co-hosting, maybe for the first time or resurrecting this podcast, is to practice for a while. Do a few episodes that don't count, that'll never see the light of day, never be released to an audience, but practice. Just like if I'm going to get a guitar, I'm not going to buy a guitar and go in front of a crowd and play it for the first time, never playing a guitar before. That's going to be horrible, just so you know, because I don't know what I'm doing. But if I go home and practice my guitar and I learn how to play, if I learn how to podcast, I learn how to co-host, and then I go out to the stage and do my thing, I've invested some time and energy to figuring out how this works. And then try a Google Doc with your co-host. Try the chat function within Zoom and see what works for you. Maybe those don't work at all. And maybe you just have a code word that you say, or there's a nod, or there's something that indicates that it's your turn to say something. That's another way that you can do it. And we're doing it right now. I just noticed you lean back a little bit. You're nodding and you're pointing towards me. That tells me it's time for me to stop talking.
I have something to say. I'm waving my hands if you can't see. I know you can't see, not if you can't see. As you're talking, amazing idea. Amazing. I could also raise in Zoom, if you're recording in Zoom, I could raise my hand so she knows that I want to say something next.
Exactly.
Yeah.
See? But that takes practice. You need to figure out between you and your co-host what works well, what doesn't work. And that will really help your audience and also your guest, because they're not going to be doing the, hey, who am I talking to? Who am I answering? What am I doing?
Yeah.
You want to make it crystal clear for the two of you. You got to find your rhythm between the two people doing co-hosting together. What works, what doesn't work, and then just do more of what works.
Great advice. I think, honestly, she and I, well, I can't speak for her.
Yeah.
Me, I'm not as well prepared, I hate to admit it, for this as I am, I guess, for my own, just because I've got too many plates in the air. And then I think, oh, crumb, it's time to record that podcast. I didn't even look to see about the guest, or maybe I know the guest a little bit. So I think that's all I need. And, I'm looking it up 3 minutes before we're hitting record.
Yeah.
And that's not a good way to go.
Right. Yeah. That comes with the time that you have available to do this. And I realize, again, you're doing this as an additional podcast on top of everything else you're doing. You have a book launching, you have a website, you have a lot going on. So
Yeah.
do what you can, right? But I guess communication is another good point as well. Let your co-host know that, hey, the upcoming interview that I have with Debbie, I don't feel really ready. Can you handle most of it? And I'll jump in and add color commentary and support you. But can you kind of lead this one? Because I'm really not prepared as well as I want to be. your co-host will be like, no problem. Thank you for telling me. And then maybe it's more of, I guess they know better than you. Then maybe you can lean on them to do most of the work, and you add your thoughts as we kind of go through the conversation.
I think that's actually happened naturally. A few of the interviews that we've done, one of us resonates more with whatever the topic is.
Yeah.
But planning it is a lot better than winging it.
Yeah, it is. I like having an organic conversation because that's what the listeners are coming to hear. They're not looking for super structured perfection. They're looking for a real conversation that they can connect with as a listener. So, yeah.
Yeah. On another topic, when you're saying perfection, I think that for many of us, that's, or at least me, that's kind of what stopped me or made me, put off trying the podcast for so long, is never feeling ready. And I think you never feel ready, right? With most things until you just dive right in there and see how it goes. And, I'm so many podcasters who've had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of episodes. They cringe when they listen to their original episodes, but look how far they've come, and they never would have gotten to episode 500 if they didn't do episode number 1.
Right. Yeah. You have to put that out there. You need to get some feedback on the podcast. You need to get some feedback on your style of podcasting and listen to your audience, because they'll tell you, do more of this and maybe a little less of that. And that's good information for you as a podcaster. But I guess the biggest thing I would encourage everyone, Debbie, is if you're starting a solo podcast or a co-hosted or an interview podcast, you really need to spend some time practicing. It's a brand new thing for people to get on a microphone and ask the questions, lead the conversation. A lot of people have never tried this before. And I go back to the guitar reference about learning and practicing. The same could be for sports. You can't imagine someone coming into a baseball stadium with a baseball bat they brought from home, stepping up to the plate and swinging at the ball for the first time and hitting a home run. That doesn't happen. There's training camps, there's practices. I've been playing baseball since I was a child, and now I'm an adult. You put time and effort into playing baseball before you ever get to the big leagues of actually playing in front of people. And I think people have this misunderstanding that if I start a podcast, I have to record everything and it has to be perfect on episode 1, and I'm overwhelmed. But you can record 10 episodes and then just never release them. And now episode 1 is actually episode 11 for you, because you've already figured it all out. You learned the tech. You learned how to talk on a microphone. You learned how to make your show notes. You learned how to co-host with another person. And then you record episode 1, because you've already invested all this time. And you're starting at a different level than meeting someone for the first time, hitting record and hoping it works.
What do you think about an oversaturated market on a topic? Is there a reason why you should not launch your own podcast? I mean, it's so easy to say, oh, look at how much there are, thousands and thousands of people talking about the same topic. What do I need to jump in there for as well?
I love your question. I love your question. Here we are on a podcast about podcasting called How to Podcast. Do you know there are hundreds of how-to podcasts out there? Only one with the name How to Podcast, which is weird to me that I actually found that. But anyways, I digress. Why would we be doing this today? And I think even in a crowded marketplace of lots of podcasts, there's probably many podcasts that look and feel like your podcast. But the one thing that's unique about your podcast, Debbie Weiss. There is no other Debbie like you. Your story on Living the Next Chapter podcast when you came on is amazing. The things that you have lived, the things you have learned, the things you have experienced, no one can duplicate you. So in a world of how to podcasts, there is no other Dave Campbell. No one else has seen the world the way I see it. No one's learned. met the people I've met, read the books I've read, gone to the schools that I've gone to. No one has seen the world through my eyes except for me. So in a world of crowded content, by being us and truly being us, truly being you, that's the uniqueness to even content that's quite common, is that your insight into that topic can't be duplicated by anyone in the entire world. That's the uniqueness of a crowded space, is you. And that's what I love, is hearing more people like you getting onto the microphone and sharing Debbie with the world. What do you think about this topic? What do you think about this guest? Because I want to hear what you think. That's what I think is the most unique thing.
Took me a long time to really believe that, but I do, because when I think about when I am a listener, how come some people don't resonate with me and others do? Like you said, we're all in our genre, whatever that is.
Yeah.
We could all be talking about the same topics, but we say it differently. Or maybe I've heard that 100 times, but for some reason, when you say it, it hits me, smacks me over the head. And like it's the first time that I heard that piece of information. It's just, it's a little intimidating when there are people out there and they're doing it well. But again, I think that once I got past that and realized I just had to get started. Yeah.
So I have an example for you.
Okay.
There is somebody that I look up to for their content, and they're way ahead of me in the length of time they've been doing this. And I had somebody ask me a question, so I sent them to that other person to get their content and get their insight, because I thought their comments were well-founded and they're very educated in what they do. They came back to me and said, "Thanks, Dave. That was interesting. Can you just tell me what they say? Because I found them to be quite crass and a little bit distracted, and I just didn't connect with them. I felt like they were very distracted in their presentation, and I felt frustrated that I couldn't follow their logic. Can you summarize and do this on your show? Because I connect with you."
Wow.
And I thought, well, okay. I never thought of it in that way. They said, I have a relationship with you as a listener, and I'd rather hear your insight than for you to send me to someone else. Can you just cover this topic instead?
How'd that make you feel?
I was shocked. And then I listened with new ears and new intention to that episode that I sent that person to, and went, yeah, that was a little distracted and a little crass and a little over opinionated. And I think that was a mistake to assume that someone was better at a topic because they've had more time in the topic. Some people just don't resonate with a host, and that's okay, because people just don't come back. That's fine. I want people to find somebody to listen to this show and go, I don't know if I like this. I don't like Dave as a host. You know what? That doesn't bother me. I'm glad that you tried the show, but find the show that works for you.
Right.
And that makes me happy, is that you found something that met your needs. So somebody might come to the Maybe I Can't podcast and go, eh. And then you're going to have hundreds of people who show up and go, this is my podcast. Debbie is my person. I'm never going anywhere else.
Yeah.
So don't worry about the people who come and then go, don't worry about them. Focus on the people that are here going, this is the podcast that I look forward to every time a new episode comes out.
Yep. Your people will find you.
Right.
I keep reciting that in my head.
Right.
So let me ask you something else, because I have a lot of friends who started podcasts, and before they started, they invested in a course.
Yeah.
What do you think about doing that versus not doing it? Did you take a course or anything before you started your first podcast?
No, I didn't. And partly because I'm a musician and I was used to the recording software, so I didn't have to worry about that side of it. If I didn't have that as my background, I would need some help to understand how to do all this tech stuff and do it well. I'm still learning that, by the way. So there's a lot of great courses out there. The only thing that makes me nervous when I recommend courses is that there's a financial commitment. I understand a financial commitment makes you more committed to follow through on the course in comparison to a free course where there's little commitment on your behalf to follow through.
Yep.
But I don't want money to be the one thing that stops somebody from getting their show into the world. And if somebody had a great message for the world and they couldn't afford to do it, I think that's a travesty. I would love to see people not have a barrier to getting their show. Oh, there's YouTube University. You can search up everything. You have to kind of filter through all of the stuff that's on YouTube that might lead you down a path you don't need to go down. So I think listening to podcasts is one of the best ways, again, to connect with somebody who's in your corner and wants to help you. That's probably the one thing I would say is I would listen to a lot, is just try to figure out who speaks to you and who helps you. And if you want to pay for a course, I know there's many great courses out there. Again, it's just the commitment to the financial. Can you financially afford to do that? So that's my only downside, I think, to courses.
I agree with that. I mean, some of my friends have said, they've found nice community with other new podcasters. Maybe they're sharing guests or sharing ideas and listening and rating and reviewing others, other people's shows and just being there to support one another.
Yeah.
But I agree. I wouldn't want that to be a barrier. I didn't take a course. Maybe I should have. Maybe I will someday. I don't know. But I knew I didn't have time. Just time on my plate, time in my schedule. And I had put it off long enough. So I figured just jump in.
Yeah. Eventually, that's something I want to work on for the How to Podcast series. I do want to offer that to people so that they can start and beginning and work their way through. So I've had people ask me to create that. So I'm working on it. For me, again, it's the pricing for that. I struggle with that, to be quite honest. I don't know how to present that to the world, but I figure if I can create episodes that help you start now for free by listening to the show. One thing I'm trying to do is blend in. I call it my podcaster's owner's manual. So like in your car, in the glove box, you have a book that tells you how to change the radio station and all that stuff, where to find the oil. I wanted to do that for podcasting. So I have very basic ABCs of getting your podcast up and running, and I just call it my owner's manual for podcasters. So I'm building that in the background as episodes, and then maybe transforming that into a course in the future. But you can listen to it now for free. You don't have to pay for it.
I think it was a podcast. Well, it must have been. I was listening to it and they were talking about how you can use AI to take your podcast episodes and turn them into a book.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't even have to sit down and write it. You've already spoken it and it'll turn it into a book that you just have to do some little editing and tweaks.
And another tip as well, I don't know if I mentioned this to you in the past, but taking your interviews when you're being on a show as a co-host or a guest, making a playlist on YouTube and putting that episode where you appeared on someone's show into a playlist, and then also go to the transcription for that episode and pull down the words that you spoke on that episode. And that could be a future chapter in a book. It could be social media content, a blog post. You've already spoken the words on the show. Those are your words. So you use them beyond the episode and use that as a content generation source for future content. Just grab the transcription.
Yeah, great idea.
See, then you're not starting with a blank page.
Which blank page is intimidating to me anyway.
And in the process of having a conversation with somebody, they might ask you a question about something you wouldn't normally think to write down or share with your community. To you, it's common knowledge. But answering the question on a podcast, you're like, you know what? I've never actually told anybody this story. I've never explained this more fully. That's great content. So just grab what you've already said and share it.
It's great because when people say, well, just post your own quotes on social media, I think to myself, I don't have any quotes.
You
What
just
have I
did
ever
one.
said?
You just did one right there.
Yeah.
I don't have any quotes.
Actually, you know what? Maybe I said it to you in the other podcast. I can't remember. That is actually, I think it's the prologue to my book. Did I tell you this already?
No.
So it's really funny that I should say that. It's either I think it's the prologue. Is I've always been a girl without a quote, and how I used to be so irritated, like even in for me, for junior high school or elementary school and then high school. It's like, well, what quote do you want next to your picture in the yearbook?
Mm.
I don't know. I don't have any quotes. Certainly at that age, I didn't have any quotes. And I would look at these quotes that other students came up with. I'm like, what's wrong with me? How can I not be inspired by anyone or anything? And then I wrote, I thought, once I graduated from college, that was all over. And then when Facebook first came around, people were putting their favorite quotes in their profile. I was like, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
So anyway, and then it goes on to talk about how now I do have a favorite quote that I just discovered. So at least now I should go back to school to get my picture in a yearbook so I can have it published somewhere. Maybe they'll edit my college yearbook from 1985.
There you go. I love it. I stumbled on one of my quotes by listening back to myself on an interview, and it just sort of happened in the moment. I just said something along the lines that so often we talk about the grass being greener on the other side of the fence in general terms. I said something along the lines is, if the grass is greener on the other side of the fence, take better care of your lawn. And I'm like, where did that come from? And I looked it up, and I can't find anybody else that said that in that context. And I'm like, instead of looking at everyone else going, I wish I had what they had, stop looking over the fence. Take care of your yard. Are you taking care of it? Are you seeding it? Are you helping it grow? Are you watering it? Instead of looking over the fence. And I'm like, wow.
That's right.
Right. And I'm like,
prolific.
I don't even know where that came from, to be quite honest. I love it. So being on a podcast like this and having your own show, interviewing guests, sparks conversation and thought and creativity and content. It's like turning on a faucet and a tap, and the water just starts coming, and then you can't shut it off. That's what's happening.
It's amazing. Think back however many years ago when it was just like network TV, and those were the only people who were communicating, and of course authors as well. But wow, now anyone can do it.
And to think that somebody right now in Dubai is going to listen to our conversation and start a podcast because you came on the show and shared your insight. Like, you don't need to have a fancy license, expensive equipment. You don't have to be a professional with training and go to school for this. You can flip on a microphone and the world can hear your voice. That's what podcasting is about.
And if we do this and only one person is affected, right? Inspired, helped, whatever it is, then I know your answer is the same. It's all worth it. Yeah. Just one person. That's why we do it.
There's a friend of mine has a podcast that helps talk to men about suicide prevention. And he got an email message back from someone who was going to take their life that week, stumbled across his podcast, and it changed his life. And that person would not potentially be here had it not been for that episode or that podcast or how the stars aligned for that all happen. But tell me if that's not the definition of success, is that someone is here today because someone got on a microphone with 10 listeners, put out an episode, and someone's life was changed. They're not making thousands of dollars from an episode. They don't have 100,000 followers. They're not making millions from their podcast. But somebody's life is different because of a podcast episode. Tell me that's not worth your time. Right? That's amazing.
Amazing.
So There's
I think that's
power
what we
in
need
our
to
words.
stop. I don't want to say another word after that.
There's power in our words, right? And what I'm afraid of, Debbie, really is there's future podcasters out there that have a message for the world. They're afraid of technology. They're afraid of, they don't have enough money to do this. They're afraid of a fancy course that costs thousands of dollars to take. They don't even know if they want to do this yet. They're looking for insight from people like you who are doing this. And they're like, Debbie, how do I do this? How do I get past my insecurities and my imposter syndrome and my fear of failure? How do I do this? What do you say to them?
Well, one, it doesn't take money. I have a microphone. I think it cost me and headphones. I think maybe it cost me about $300, but I didn't start with that.
Yeah.
I record my podcasts on Zoom through my computer. No special microphone initially, nothing. So it didn't cost me any money at all. And for me, like I said, I didn't have the time, or if I'm being honest, I'm not really interested in the technical part.
Good.
So I did outsource it, but one, you don't have to. Most people, you can learn it yourself. Like you said, you don't need a course. There's so many pieces of software out there that don't cost anything. There is a free version that you can use. And if you do want to source it out, I hear some people paying these crazy, crazy amounts of dollars. And it seems like it's, the diamond version that is completely not necessary. And there are people out there on, what is it, Upwork and Fiverr and all these places that really do not charge a lot of money if you're intimidated and don't want to do it yourself.
Yeah.
And so money should never be an issue. No reason to not get started.
Amazing. Yeah. And I actually created a website called podcastforfree.com. How's that, right? And I link all of the free resources that I use. With 7 shows, I can't afford 7 times the cost of everything. That's ridiculous. So I'm trying to find free resources to help people start their podcast and run their podcast. So freepodcast.com, or podcastforfree.com. I said it backwards. Podcastforfree.com is my new website. But anyway, so that's just some resources for people to use. So I want to help people get on the microphone and create their show. That's the whole point.
Well, I'll be looking up that website as soon as we leave the meeting.
There you go. I love it. Anything else that you wanted to chat about? I really appreciate you being here with me today as a co-host.
No, like I said, I'm so happy to be here and didn't see why, but you know what? We had a wonderful conversation, and I hope that at least I brought to the table that you don't have to feel like you're a natural and have all this background and take a fancy course and pay all this money. That, you know what? It's worth it. Just hit record and start talking.
Tell us again about Maybe I Can podcast. Where should we go? Where should we start listening? Tell us more.
You should start listening wherever you listen to a podcast, right? Good. Just look it up. Maybe I Can with Debbie Weiss. And, like I said, mostly we doing a combination of solo and interviews to inspire you, listen to other people's stories who overcame circumstances, and some tips and tricks and personal experience from what worked for me. So.
And promote the book that's coming out in August.
Yes. Thank you so much, Dave. I appreciate that. So on August 9th, 2023, my memoir On Second Thought, Maybe I Can, is coming out. And wait, hold on. I know other people can't see, but this was very exciting to me. It just came in the mail a few days ago because when you write a book, you don't have the physical copy. And I never even printed it. I used Google Docs to write my book.
Wow.
I never had a printed copy. So it's like, you know what you're doing, but until you actually hold it, it doesn't feel real. So hold on, please.
Come on.
I just got to turn around from the microphone. So here it is.
Oh, wow.
In
Come
full
on.
color. Look, it's a real book with a real back and everything.
Wow.
And I don't know if I told you last week, but I had this incredible experience of meeting Jack Canfield, the co-author of the Chicken Soup for the Soul series.
Really?
Yeah. And actually, if you go on my social, there's a little bit of an interview that he interviewed me for about 3 or 4 minutes.
Wow.
And now that you said I have to brag, so one of the things that he said, because he didn't read my whole book, but he read portions of it. And this is a quote that I am allowed to use, and it is on my book cover. And it says, "I really want to encourage you to read her book. It's really delightfully written. It made me smile a lot, and it will teach you a lot of lessons and inspire and motivate you to tackle the things that are stopping you from getting where you want to go." Jack Canfield's co-author of Chicken Soup for the Soul series.
Come on.
Yeah.
Home run.
Home run is right. Yeah. My wildest dreams. I just still blown away.
Well, congratulations in advance on the launch of the book. Everyone, please go buy the book. Leave a great rating and review where you buy your book as well. And also go over and check out Debbie's website. We have all the links in the show notes. Go listen to the podcast. Like, follow, share, and give Debbie lots of love. Thank you, Debbie, for making time to be here and to talk about your podcast.
Thank you. Well, I only did 2. Now I've been on 2 episodes, so I'm waiting for the invites to the other 5.
And you have to come back as well. I always want you to come back. I'm leaving the door open, a crack. You can just come in anytime you want. And let's continue the conversation.
Would love that. Thank you again.
Awesome. Everyone, please go check out all the links, please. And let Debbie know you listen to her here on the How to Podcast series. A new podcast for everyone to go check out and listen to. Thanks, Debbie.
Thank you.